The Haleveil family entered the Obsidian Hall expecting to find a monster alone in the dark. They had dressed their perfect daughter Elara in silk and diamonds, rehearsed her curtsy 100 times, and left their crippled daughter, Lysandra, locked in a freezing tower with nothing but moths and memories. But when the iron doors groaned open and torchlight flooded the throne room, Lord Haleveil's rehearsed smile died on his lips. King Vaelor Morvain was kneeling. The vampire king, draped in black armor that had seen 1,000 wars, was on one knee beside the Obsidian Throne, his pale fingers adjusting the midnight blue hem of a velvet gown. The court stood in terrified silence, nobles frozen mid-breath, as the king rose and stepped back to reveal the woman seated in an enchanted wheelchair upon the royal dais. Lysandra turned her head. Her dark hair was crowned with the circlet of stars. Her sharp eyes met her father's across the chamber. The paralyzed daughter they had abandoned hours ago was now sitting at the right hand of death itself. Vaelor's crimson eyes never left the Haleveil's as he leaned close to Lysandra's ear and asked one question loud enough for every vampire in the hall to hear. "Are these the mortals who kept you in a cage?" The temperature dropped 20 degrees. What happened next would destroy a bloodline built on cruelty. Hello, friends. Welcome to our story. Before we begin, please like this video and subscribe. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We want to know. The night of the Crimson Solstice, the sky above Haleveil Manor burned the color of old blood. Snow fell in silent sheets, blanketing the estate in white. But no warmth reached the North Tower, where Lysandra Haleveil sat alone in the dark. She had lived her entire life in that tower, ever since the riding accident at age 12 had stolen the use of her legs and, in her family's eyes, her value. She was 23 now, and she had learned what it meant to be invisible. The servants brought food when they remembered. Her mother sent up old dresses that no longer fit anyone else. Her father had stopped visiting years ago, and her younger sister, Elara, the golden child who could walk and dance and charm, had long since stopped pretending they were family. Lysandra didn't mind the solitude most nights. It gave her time to read, to think, to sharpen her mind on philosophy and strategy, while the rest of her family sharpened their smiles. But tonight was different. Tonight was the Crimson Solstice Ball, the most important night in vampire politics in a century. King Vaelor Morvain, the last of the Morvain bloodline, was rumored to be seeking a mortal consort to stabilize his reign. Every noble family in the realm was attending, draped in their finest silks and jewels, dragging their eligible daughters forward like offerings to a god. The Haleveils were no exception. Lysandra had watched from her tower window as her family prepared to leave. She'd seen Elara twirling in a gown of silver and pearl. She'd heard her mother's voice echoing up the stone stairwell. "Make sure the cripple has water. We'll be back in 3 days. No firewood, no blankets, no candles, just cold stone, falling snow, and the creeping certainty that her family hoped she wouldn't survive the winter." Lysandra sat in her wheelchair, an old wooden thing with a broken wheel that scraped against the floor, and stared at the frosted window. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, though it did little against the biting cold seeping through the cracks in the walls. Her fingers were numb. Her breath came out in clouds. But her mind was sharp, honed by years of isolation into something her family had never bothered to notice: a blade. She could feel them, even from a distance. Not physically, but something deeper. Since childhood, Lysandra had possessed a strange sensitivity. an ability to sense the emotional currents of those around her. Fear, rage, joy, despair. It was a curse she'd learned to bury, because no one wanted a crippled daughter who could also read minds. But tonight, alone in the dark, she felt nothing. Her family had gone, and they had left no trace of love or guilt behind. The tower was silent, except for the wind, until it wasn't. The cold air shifted. The shadows in the corner of the room deepened, stretching like ink spilled across the floor. Lysandra's breath caught. She turned her head toward the window, where frost had begun to crawl across the glass in patterns too deliberate to be natural. And then she heard it, the sound of wings, massive leathery wings beating against the winter sky. Dark figures appeared outside her window, cloaked in shadow, their eyes glowing faintly silver in the moonlight. They moved with inhuman grace, silent as death. And when the window shattered inward in a spray of ice and glass, Lysandra did not scream. She simply stared as the Night Stalkers, the king's personal guard, stepped into her tower and bowed. The lead Night Stalker removed his hood, revealing a face carved from marble and menace. His voice was low, reverent, and edged with something Lysandra couldn't place. Awe. "Lady Haleveil, the king has sent for you." Lysandra's heart hammered in her chest, but her voice remained steady. "Sent for me? I think you have the wrong daughter." The Night Stalker's silver eyes flicked to her wheelchair, then back to her face. "We do not." Before she could respond, two more guards entered, carrying between them an object that stole her breath. A wheelchair unlike anything she had ever seen. It was forged from black steel and dark wood, engraved with lunar symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. The seat was cushioned in velvet, the wheels reinforced with enchantments that made them hover an inch above the ground. They lifted her gently, reverently, as though she were made of glass and starlight, and placed her in the enchanted chair. It adjusted to her body instantly, warm and impossibly comfortable. And when the Night Stalker touched a rune on the armrest, the chair rose into the air. Lysandra gasped as they carried her through the shattered window and into the night sky. The wind roared around her, snow stinging her cheeks, but the chair never faltered. Below, Haleveil Manor shrank into a distant shadow. Above, the crimson moon burned like a wound in the heavens. And ahead, rising from the frozen landscape like a crown of black thorns, was the Obsidian Palace. Lysandra had been invisible her entire life. But as the Night Stalkers carried her toward the vampire court, she realized with a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. She was about to become impossible to ignore. Lysandra woke that morning to the sound of her sister's laughter echoing through the manor walls. It was a bright, crystalline sound that cut through stone and silence like a blade, and it meant Elara was in a good mood. That was never good news for Lysandra. She pulled herself upright in bed, her arms trembling with the effort. Her legs lay useless beneath the thin blanket, pale and still as marble. Every morning began this way, a negotiation with her own body, a careful choreography of transfers and adjustments that no one in her family had bothered to witness in years. She reached for the wooden wheelchair beside her bed, the one with the broken wheel that scraped and caught on every uneven stone. It took 3 attempts to shift her weight, her muscles screaming in protest before she finally settled into the seat. The tower room was small and cold, its walls bare except for water stains and the faint outlines where tapestries had once hung. Dust motes drifted through the grey morning light, filtering through a single narrow window. This had been a storage room once, filled with forgotten furniture and moth-eaten linens. Now it was her entire world. She wheeled herself to the window and looked down at the courtyard below. Servants scurried like ants, carrying bolts of silk and crates of wine. Carriages were being polished until they gleamed. The entire manor was alive with preparation for tonight's Crimson Solstice Ball, and Lysandra felt the energy like a pressure against her skull. Excitement, anxiety, greed, ambition. It crashed over her in waves, each emotion distinct and sharp. She closed her eyes and pressed her palms against her temples, willing the sensations away. This was her curse, the ability to feel what others felt, to taste their emotions like ash on her tongue. As a child, she'd told her mother about it once. Lady Haleveil had called it hysteria and locked her in the tower for 3 days. Lysandra had never spoken of it again. The door to her room crashed open. Elara swept in, radiant in a dressing gown of cream silk, her golden hair pinned with pearls. She was 17, beautiful, whole, and she knew it. "Still alive, I see," Elara said, wrinkling her nose at the musty air. "Mother was hoping you might have rolled down the stairs by now. Would have saved us the trouble of explaining you at the ball." Lysandra kept her face neutral, though she felt the barbed cruelty radiating from her sister like heat from a fire. "I wasn't aware I was being explained." "You're not." Elara examined her reflection in the window glass, adjusting a curl. "You're being left behind, obviously. Can you imagine? The king is choosing a consort tonight, and the Haleveils will present only their finest." She glanced at Lysandra's wheelchair with theatrical pity. "No broken things allowed." The words landed like stones, but Lysandra had armor built from years of this. "I hope you freeze your smile in place permanently. It would suit you." Elara's eyes flashed, but before she could respond, their mother's voice rang from downstairs. "Elara, the seamstress is waiting." With a final withering look, Elara left, slamming the door behind her. Hours passed. Lysandra rationed the stale bread and cheese left on her desk, knowing it might be days before anyone returned. She tried to read, but the cold made her fingers stiff and clumsy. By late afternoon, the temperature had dropped noticeably. She realized, with creeping dread, that no one had brought firewood. Evening fell. Through her window, she watched her family depart in their gilded carriage, her father stern and calculating, her mother dripping in jewels, Elara glowing like a star. None of them looked up. The cold deepened. Lysandra wrapped herself in every threadbare blanket she owned and positioned her chair near the window, hoping for moonlight to provide some illusion of warmth. Her breath fogged in the air. Ice began forming on the inside of the glass. She was going to freeze to death, and no one would know until they returned to find her corpse. That's when the shadows moved. At first, she thought it was exhaustion playing tricks, but the darkness in the corner of the room thickened, pooled, spread like spilled ink. The temperature dropped even further, but this cold felt different, deliberate, alive. Lysandra's psychic sense flared in warning, but what she felt wasn't malice. It was reverence. The window exploded inward. Glass and ice scattered across the floor as massive figures filled the frame, cloaked in shadow and moonlight, their eyes glowing silver in the dark, and they bowed. The lead figure stepped through the shattered window with inhuman grace, his boots crunching on broken glass without a sound. He was tall, wrapped in black armor that seemed to drink the moonlight. And when he lowered his hood, Lysandra saw a face carved from pale stone. and shadow. His eyes were silver, ancient, and fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Lady Lysandra Haleveil," he said, his voice like gravel wrapped in velvet. "The king has summoned you." Terror shot through her. The king. Vampire king. She was going to die. Not from cold, but from teeth and hunger. "You have the wrong person," she managed, her voice steadier than she felt. "My sister Elara is the one attending the ball. She's—" "We do not want your sister." The Night Stalker moved closer, and two others emerged from the darkness behind him, carrying something between them that stole the words from Lysandra's throat. It was a wheelchair, but nothing like the broken wooden thing she sat in. This was forged from black steel and midnight wood, engraved with silver runes that pulsed with faint light. The seat was cushioned in velvet, the color of deep night, and the wheels hovered above the ground, spinning slowly without touching the floor. "We have no intention of harming you, my lady," the Night Stalker said, and to Lysandra's shock, he knelt. "The king has been searching for you for a very long time." Before she could protest, gentle hands lifted her from her chair. She wanted to fight, to scream, but the psychic wave that rolled off them stopped her cold. It wasn't cruelty she felt. It was awe, reverence, fear, yes, but not of her, for her. They placed her in the enchanted wheelchair, and warmth flooded through her immediately. The seat molded to her body, supportive and impossibly comfortable. One of the Night Stalkers touched a rune on the armrest, and the chair rose smoothly into the air. "Hold on, my lady." Then they were moving. The chair glided through the broken window and into the night sky, carried by the Night Stalkers, whose dark wings unfurled like shadows given form. Lysandra's scream died in her throat as the ground fell away beneath her. Wind tore at her hair and clothes, snow stinging her face. But the chair remained steady, cocooned in some invisible shield that kept her from falling. Below, the world became a tapestry of white and black, forests, frozen rivers, distant villages glowing like embers. Above, the crimson moon burned cold and huge. And ahead, rising from the darkness, like a crown of obsidian thorns, was the palace. The Obsidian Palace was a nightmare-given architecture. Towers spiraled toward the sky, their spires sharp as daggers. Walls of black stone reflected the moonlight in shades of blood and silver. Gargoyles perched along the battlements, their eyes glowing faintly as the Night Stalkers approached. The entire structure pulsed with ancient power, and Lysandra felt it against her mind, like a hand pressing on glass. They descended through a balcony entrance, bypassing the grand halls below. Lysandra expected dungeons, chains, darkness. Instead, they carried her through corridors lined with silk tapestries and floating candles, past chambers filled with treasures that would make kingdoms weep. The wealth was obscene, overwhelming, and utterly indifferent to her presence. Finally, they stopped before a set of double doors carved with lunar phases. The Night Stalker captain pushed them open. "His Majesty is not himself tonight," he said quietly, almost apologetically. "Do not be afraid." The doors opened, and Lysandra's world narrowed to a single point. The chamber was vast and circular, dominated by a dais at its center, and on that dais, surrounded by shattered furniture and claw marks gouged deep into the stone floor, was King Vaelor Morvain. He was magnificent and terrifying. Tall, draped in black armor that seemed grown rather than forged, his pale hair falling past his shoulders. But his eyes were pure crimson, glowing with mindless rage. His lips were pulled back in a snarl, revealing fangs that gleamed like ivory knives. He moved like a caged animal, pacing, clawing at the air, his breathing ragged and inhuman. The red haze. She'd heard whispers of it. The madness that consumed vampire royalty. "Your Majesty," the Night Stalker began, "we have brought—" Vaelor's head snapped toward them, and he lunged. Lysandra didn't think. She simply reached out with her mind, that cursed sensitivity she'd spent years suppressing, and touched his consciousness. It was like plunging into a storm of blood and fury, a howling void where reason had drowned. But she didn't pull back. She held steady, a single point of stillness in the chaos. The king stopped mid-lunge, his crimson eyes locked onto hers, and slowly, like ice melting under sunlight, the red began to fade, replaced by deep violet edged in silver. Vaelor straightened, his breathing slowing, his claws retracting. He stared at Lysandra as though seeing the sun for the first time in centuries. "You," he whispered, his voice broken and raw. "You're real." Vaelor sank to his knees on the dais, his armor scraping against stone. For a moment, he simply stared at Lysandra, his violet eyes wide with something she couldn't name. Relief, disbelief, desperation. The Night Stalkers had retreated to the shadows, leaving them alone in the vast chamber. "How long?" His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "How long have you been able to do that?" Lysandra's hands trembled on the armrests of her chair. "Do what?" "Silence the storm." He pressed a palm to his chest, over his heart. "I have been drowning in madness for 300 years. Every day the red haze grows stronger. It devours reason, memory, everything that makes me more than a beast. My father succumbed to it. My grandfather before him. Every Morvain king for 1,000 years has died screaming in the dark, tearing apart everything they loved." He looked up at her, and she saw the truth written in his ancient eyes. He was terrified. "I have searched the world for someone who could anchor me. Mages, priests, blood witches, none of them could touch the haze. But you—" His voice broke. "You walked into my mind, and the storm simply stopped." Lysandra felt his emotions like a tidal wave. Exhaustion, hope, shame, and beneath it all, a yawning fear of what he would become without her. She understood isolation. She understood being trapped in a body that betrayed you, a mind that made you a monster in others' eyes. "You want to use me," she said quietly. "Yes." He didn't flinch from the accusation. "I am offering you a bargain, Lady Haleveil. Be my anchor. Stand at my side and keep the madness at bay. In return, I will give you everything you have been denied. Power, respect, freedom, a throne, if you wish it. And if I refuse," Vaelor's jaw tightened, "then I will have you returned to your tower unharmed, but I will be dead within the month, and this kingdom will fall into chaos." He leaned forward, his gaze burning into hers. "I am not asking for charity, and I am not offering it. This is survival, for both of us." Lysandra studied him, this ancient predator, kneeling before her broken body, offering her the world. "I have conditions. Name them. I am not your pet. I am not your prize. If I do this, I do it as your equal. I want agency, not protection. I want a voice in your court, not a decorative throne. And if you ever lock me away the way my family did—" Her voice turned to ice. "I will let the red haze take you, and I will watch you burn." For a long moment, Vaelor said nothing. Then, slowly, a smile curved his lips. Genuine, surprised, and edged with something like admiration. "You are not what I expected. Neither are you." He rose in a single fluid motion, and extended his hand. "Then we have an accord, Lady Haleveil. You keep me sane, I make you untouchable." She took his hand, and power crackled between them, her psychic signature locking into his fractured mind like a key turning in a rusted lock. The bond settled over them both, invisible but undeniable. Vaelor called for his attendants. Within moments, the chamber filled with silent figures carrying bolts of silk, jewels that caught the candlelight like captured stars, and oils that smelled of night-blooming flowers. They tended to Lysandra's cuts from the broken glass, their touches gentle and efficient. They washed the grime from her skin and combed the tangles from her hair until it fell in dark waves past her shoulders. When they dressed her, it was not in the pale, modest colors her family favored. They draped her in midnight blue velvet, embroidered with silver constellations, a gown that made her skin glow and her eyes shine like polished amber. They fastened a circlet of white gold and moonstones around her brow. Not a crown, not yet, but close enough to make a statement. When the attendants stepped back, Lysandra barely recognized herself. Vaelor approached, carrying a velvet pillow. Resting on it was a silver pendant shaped like a crescent moon pierced by a thorn. "The royal crest," he said softly, and fastened it around her neck himself. Then he moved behind her chair. His hands gripped the handles. "Your Majesty," one of the Night Stalkers began, alarmed. "You need not—" "I will push her chair myself," Vaelor said, his voice allowing no argument. "Let the court see. Let them understand." And as he wheeled Lysandra toward the doors that would lead to the Crimson Solstice Ball, she realized the truth. The King of Vampires had just knelt before the world. For her. The doors to the Obsidian Hall towered 3 stories high, carved from black iron and inlaid with rubies that pulsed like heartbeats. Behind them, Lysandra could hear the ball, a symphony of sound that made her psychic senses flare in warning. Hundreds of voices, laughter sharp as broken glass, the rustle of silk and leather, the clink of crystal goblets filled with blood wine. The emotional weight of so many immortal predators pressed against her mind like a physical force. Hunger, ambition, cruelty, ancient boredom, punctuated by fleeting excitement. She closed her eyes and breathed through it, anchoring herself the way she'd learned to in her tower. When she opened them again, Vaelor was watching her with concern. "If it's too much, we can wait," he said quietly, his hands still resting on her wheelchair. "No," Lysandra straightened her spine, lifting her chin. "Open the doors." The Night Stalkers obeyed. The iron doors groaned open, and sound crashed over them like a wave. The Obsidian Hall was a cathedral of darkness and decadence. The vaulted ceiling disappeared into shadow, held aloft by columns of black marble veined with crimson. Chandeliers dripping with crystal and candlelight hung like frozen stars. The walls were lined with stained glass windows depicting ancient battles, their colors bleeding across the polished obsidian floor. And everywhere, were vampires. They filled the hall in a sea of silk and armor, their pale faces turning as one toward the entrance. The music stuttered and died. Conversation ceased. 1,000 immortal eyes fixed on Lysandra, and she felt their collective shock ripple through the psychic space like thunder. Vaelor pushed her chair forward with deliberate slowness, giving the court time to absorb what they were seeing. The crowd parted before them, nobles stepping back in stunned silence. Whispers began, low, confused, tinged with fear. "Who is she? A mortal? Why does the king himself—" They reached the dais at the far end of the hall, where the Obsidian Throne sat like a crown of black glass and iron thorns. Beside it, a second throne had been placed, smaller but no less magnificent. Vaelor stopped between them and turned to face Lysandra. Without a word, he knelt. Then, with a gentleness that silenced even the whispers, he lifted her from the enchanted wheelchair. Lysandra's breath caught as he cradled her against his chest, her useless legs draped over his arm, and carried her up the 3 steps to the dais. He placed her on the second throne. The velvet cushions adjusted to her body, supportive and warm. Then Vaelor positioned her enchanted wheelchair directly beside the throne, within arm's reach, and took his own seat. He reached over and rested his hand on the arm of her chair, a gesture of both possession and protection. The court stared in paralyzed silence. "Breathe," Vaelor murmured, low enough that only she could hear. "You are exactly where you belong." Lysandra scanned the crowd of pale, beautiful, dangerous faces and felt their confusion like static in the air. Then the herald's voice rang out, formal and cold. "Lord Casimir Haleveil, Lady Morvain Haleveil, and Lady Elara Haleveil of Haleveil Manor." The crowd shifted, creating a path, and there, framed in the doorway, draped in gold and silk and dripping with jewels, stood her family. Lord Haleveil entered first, his chest puffed with rehearsed confidence. Lady Morvain followed, her practiced smile already in place. And then Elara, glowing in her silver gown, her chin lifted in anticipation of her moment of triumph. They scanned the room for the king, found him seated on his throne. Their eyes slid past Lysandra as though she were invisible, just as they always had. Then Lord Haleveil's gaze snapped back, his rehearsed smile fractured. Lady Morvain's hand flew to her throat, Elara's face drained of all color. Lysandra met their stares with perfect calm, her fingers resting lightly on the armrest of her throne. The circlet of stars gleamed on her brow, the royal crest hung at her throat, and beside her, King Vaelor Morvain leaned close enough that his pale hair brushed her shoulder, and asked in a voice that carried across the entire hall, "Are these the mortals who kept you in a cage?" The temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Every vampire in the hall went perfectly still, their predatory instincts sensing blood in the water. And Lysandra smiled. Lord Haleveil's shock lasted only 3 heartbeats. Then, like the practiced politician he was, his face transformed. The horror melted into relief, the shame into concern, and he stepped forward with his arms outstretched as though approaching a lost child. "Lysandra," his voice boomed across the hall, warm and paternal. "Thank the gods you're safe. We've been searching everywhere for you. When we discovered your room empty, we feared the worst. Kidnapping, or worse still." He shot a carefully calculated glance at the vampire nobles, his implication clear. He turned back to the dais, his smile strained but intact. "Come down now, darling. Let's get you home where you belong." The court stirred, confusion rippling through the crowd. Whispers began. Was the mortal truly lost? Had there been a misunderstanding? Vaelor remained utterly still, his hand resting on Lysandra's armrest. But he said nothing. His violet eyes slid to her, and she understood. This was her moment, her choice, her voice. Lysandra leaned forward slightly, her fingers curling around the arms of her throne. When she spoke, her voice was quiet, but it carried through the hall with crystalline clarity. "You left me in a tower with no heat, Father, no firewood, no candles. The temperature was below freezing." She paused, letting the words settle like stones. You left me a crust of bread and a pitcher of water. You told the servants not to check on me for 3 days. You said, and I quote, "Make sure the cripple has water. We'll be back when it's done." Lord Haleveil's smile flickered. Lysandra, you misunderstood. Did I mishear my sister telling me that broken things weren't allowed at the ball? Lysandra's gaze shifted to Elara, who stood frozen, her silver gown suddenly looking like armor that was too heavy. Or my mother saying it would be convenient if I rolled down the stairs before you returned. Lady Morvain's face went white. The whispers in the court grew louder, sharper. Nobles leaned toward each other, their ancient eyes gleaming with interest. Scandal was currency in the vampire court, and the Haleveils were suddenly bankrupt. You ungrateful... Lord Haleveil's mask slipped, rage bleeding through. After everything we've done for you, kept you fed, housed, cared for despite your condition, you kept me locked in a storage room for 11 years. Lysandra's voice didn't rise, but it cut like a blade. You treated me like a shameful secret, and tonight, you left me to freeze to death so you could offer my sister to the king. The hall erupted in whispers. Vaelor's hand tightened imperceptibly on her armrest, but he still said nothing. He was giving her this, the chance to speak her truth without his shadow over it. Elara, her face flushed with humiliation and fury, stepped forward. You're twisting everything. Her voice was shrill, desperate. You're sitting up there, playing victim. But let's be honest about what you are, Lysandra. She gestured at the wheelchair with vicious contempt. You're a cripple, a broken, useless burden who can't even walk. And now, you've seduced the king with whatever pathetic magic trick you've managed. But it won't last. He'll tire of you the moment he realizes you can't even stand on your own 2 legs, let alone... The words died in her throat. Vaelor had risen from his throne. The movement was so sudden, so absolutely silent, that it sucked the air from the room. His violet eyes were no longer violet. They were crimson, pure, burning crimson. The red haze was coming. His lips pulled back from his fangs in a snarl that was barely human. His hands curled into claws, black talons extending with an audible snick. The air around him began to shimmer with heat and violence, and every vampire in the hall took an instinctive step backward. Lord Haleveil stumbled. Lady Morvain grabbed Elara's arm, dragging her back. The guards reached for their weapons, but froze, knowing that nothing could stop a Morvain king in the grip of the haze. Vaelor descended from the dais, each step deliberate, predatory, his gaze locked on Elara like a wolf selecting prey. The madness in his eyes was absolute. There was no reason left, no mercy, only rage and the promise of blood. Vaelor, Lysandra's voice cut through the red fog, not loud, not commanding, just present. He stopped, one clawed hand raised inches from Elara's face. Vaelor, Lysandra said again, reaching out with her mind, finding the storm inside him and anchoring herself in its center. Not yet. The crimson in his eyes flickered, fought, then slowly, agonizingly, began to recede. But it was too late. The words, "not yet," had pulled him back from the immediate kill, but the haze had tasted blood hunger, and it would not be denied. Vaelor's head snapped toward the Haleveils again, his crimson eyes no longer recognizing them as people, only as threats to be eliminated, obstacles to be destroyed. The transformation was horrifying. His pale skin took on an ashen quality, veins darkening beneath the surface like cracks in porcelain. His fangs lengthened until they curved past his lower lip, glistening and sharp as scalpels. The elegant armor he wore seemed to warp, becoming organic, growing barbs and ridges that looked more bone than metal. His fingers extended into true claws, black as obsidian and dripping with something that hissed when it hit the floor. But it was his presence that changed most. The careful control, the ancient dignity, the carefully maintained humanity, all of it burned away. What remained was pure predator, a creature of instinct and violence that had been apex for 1,000 years before civilization was a whisper. The court erupted into chaos. Nobles scattered like leaves before a storm, their supernatural grace reduced to panicked flight. Some threw themselves behind columns. Others fled for the exits, their silk gowns and velvet capes abandoned in their wake. The guards drew weapons with shaking hands, silver swords and enchanted spears, but not one of them moved to intercept their king. They knew what everyone in that hall knew. You cannot stop a Morvain in the red haze. You can only survive. Please. Lord Haleveil stumbled backward, his dignity shattered, his carefully constructed persona crumbling. Your Majesty, please, we meant no offense. It was a misunderstanding. Vaelor moved, not like a man, but like death itself. Fluid, inevitable, terrifying in its grace. He closed the distance to Lord Haleveil in 3 strides, each footfall cracking the obsidian floor. His clawed hand shot out and grabbed the lord by the throat, lifting him off the ground as easily as a child lifts a doll. Lady Morvain screamed. Elara collapsed to her knees, her silver dress pooling around her like spilled mercury. Stop, please stop. But Vaelor didn't hear them. Lysandra felt his consciousness now, a maelstrom of rage and pain and centuries of accumulated madness. The red haze wasn't just anger. It was every moment of control lost, every shred of humanity eroded, every death of his bloodline echoing through his fractured mind. He was drowning in it, and he was taking the Haleveils down with him. His claws tightened on Lord Haleveil's throat. Blood began to seep between his fingers. The Night Stalkers moved then, finally, desperately. They surrounded their king, weapons lowered in submission, voices raised in pleas. Your Majesty, please, sire, you must fight it. The kingdom needs you. Vaelor snarled at them, a sound so inhuman, it froze the blood in Lysandra's veins. He threw Lord Haleveil across the room like a broken toy. The lord crashed into a column and crumpled, unconscious or dead. Lysandra couldn't tell. Then Vaelor turned on the guards, on his own Night Stalkers. The court screamed. This was how kingdoms fell. This was how dynasties ended, not with war or revolution, but with a king tearing apart everyone he'd sworn to protect. And Lysandra understood, with perfect clarity, why she was here, why the enchanted chair, why the reverence, why the desperate search across centuries. She was not a consort. She was not a companion. She was a leash on a god. Vaelor lunged at the nearest Night Stalker, claws raised for a killing blow. The guard didn't raise his sword. He simply closed his eyes and accepted his death. Lysandra didn't think. She couldn't afford to. She reached out with her mind, not gently this time, not carefully, and slammed into Vaelor's consciousness with every ounce of psychic strength she possessed. It was like throwing herself into a furnace. The red haze scorched her, tried to consume her, but she held on. She anchored herself to the core of him, the part that was still Vaelor Morvain, still a king, still something more than a monster. Stop. The command wasn't spoken aloud. It reverberated through the psychic link between them, through the bond they'd forged, and it carried the weight of every moment she'd survived alone in that tower. Every time she'd refused to break. Every ounce of will that had kept her alive when her family wanted her dead. Vaelor froze mid-strike, his claws inches from the Night Stalker's face. And for the first time in 300 years, the red haze shattered completely. Inside Vaelor's mind, the red haze was a living thing. Lysandra's consciousness plunged into a storm of crimson and black, a howling void where memory and madness had fused into something monstrous. She saw fragments of his past, a young prince watching his father claw out his own eyes, a coronation drenched in blood, centuries of loneliness stretching like an endless winter. And beneath it all, the haze itself, a seething mass of rage and despair that had been feeding on his bloodline for generations, growing stronger with each king it consumed. It recognized her immediately. The storm turned its attention toward her, 1,000 voices screaming in unison, demanding she submit, demanding she break, demanding she drown with him. But Lysandra had been drowning her entire life. She knew how to hold her breath. She pushed deeper, past the screaming voices, past the memories of violence and loss, searching for the core of him, the part that remembered what it meant to be more than a beast. She found it buried beneath centuries of pain, a single point of light, flickering like a candle in a hurricane. "Vaelor," she called into the darkness, her psychic voice steady and clear. "You are not this. You are not just hunger and rage. You are a king. You are my anchor as much as I am yours, and I will not let you fall." The haze surged against her, trying to tear her apart, but she held firm. She wrapped her consciousness around that flickering light and fed it every ounce of strength she had, every moment of survival. Every time she'd refused to let her family's cruelty define her, every spark of will that had kept her alive in that frozen tower. The light grew, slowly at first, then brighter, stronger, until it began to push back against the storm. In the physical world, Lysandra's eyes snapped open. Her hands gripped the armrests of her enchanted wheelchair, and without hesitation, she commanded it forward. The chair glided down from the dais, across the obsidian floor scattered with shattered glass and spilled wine, directly toward the frozen tableau of violence. Vaelor still stood over the Night Stalker, his claws raised, his body locked mid-strike by her psychic command. His crimson eyes tracked her movement, confused, feral, struggling against invisible chains. She didn't stop. She wheeled herself directly between the king and her family, her abusive, cruel, worthless family who were cowering on the floor behind her. The court gasped. Nobles who had been fleeing paused to watch, disbelief written across their ancient faces. She was shielding them. The mortal was placing herself between a maddened vampire king and his prey. Lysandra reached up and took Vaelor's clawed hand in both of hers. His skin was burning hot, his claws slick with something dark and terrible. But she didn't flinch. She met his crimson gaze and spoke aloud, her voice carrying through the silent hall. "Come back to me." The psychic link between them blazed white-hot. Inside his mind, the light she'd kindled exploded outward, shattering the storm. The red haze shrieked and recoiled, its hold breaking like rotted rope. And Vaelor, the real Vaelor, surged back to the surface. His crimson eyes flickered, dimmed, shifted back to violet, edged in silver. The transformation reversed as quickly as it had come. His claws retracted, his fangs receded. The monstrous aspect melted away, leaving behind the elegant, exhausted king who had knelt before her in his chambers. He stared at their joined hands as though seeing them for the first time, then slowly, deliberately, sank to his knees before her wheelchair. The court froze in absolute silence. King Vaelor Morvain, last of his bloodline, sovereign of the vampire realm, pressed his forehead against Lysandra's hand and whispered two words that echoed through the hall like a death knell for the old order. "Thank you." Behind Lysandra, Lord Haleveil struggled to his feet, coughing blood. Lady Morgaine clutched Elara, both of them staring at their forgotten daughter with dawning horror. They finally understood what the court had just witnessed. Lysandra Haleveil didn't sit beside the Vampire King because she was his consort. She sat beside him because she was the only thing keeping him from burning the world to ash. The nobles began to whisper again, but the tone had changed entirely. It was no longer confusion or scandal. It was fear. And beneath the fear, something far more dangerous: respect. A vampire lord near the front of the crowd slowly lowered himself to one knee. Then another followed, and another. Within moments, the entire court was kneeling, not to their king, but to the mortal woman in the wheelchair who had just done the impossible. Lysandra looked out at the sea of bowed heads and understood, with perfect clarity, that her life would never be small again. Vaelor remained on his knees for a long moment, his hands still clasped in Lysandra's. When he finally rose, his movements were slow, careful, as though testing the boundaries of his own body. The violet had fully returned to his eyes, but exhaustion lined his face, the kind that came not from physical exertion, but from fighting oneself and losing. He looked down at Lysandra, and something passed between them through their bond: understanding, trust, a recognition that she had not only saved his life, but preserved what remained of his humanity. Without a word, Vaelor reached into his armor and withdrew a small object that made the entire court draw a collective breath. The royal seal, a ring of black gold, set with a crimson stone that pulsed like a heartbeat. It was more than jewelry. It was the symbol of absolute authority in the vampire realm, the mark that turned words into law. He placed it in Lysandra's palm and closed her fingers around it. "Their fate is yours to decide," he said quietly, though his voice carried through the silent hall. "I trust your judgment more than my own." Lysandra looked down at the seal, feeling its weight, its power, its terrible responsibility. Then she looked up at her family. Lord Haleveil had managed to pull himself upright, though blood still trickled from his mouth. He took a shaky step forward, his politician's instincts kicking in even now, even after everything. "Lysandra," he began, his voice hoarse but attempting warmth. "Daughter, I know we've had our differences, but surely you understand. We're family, blood. We may have made mistakes, but that bond is sacred. You cannot... Do not call me daughter." Lysandra's voice was ice. "You forfeited that right the day you locked me in a tower and prayed I'd die quietly." Lady Morgaine stumbled forward, dropping to her knees with a rustle of silk. "Please, Lysandra, we were wrong. We see that now. But we're your family, your blood. You cannot condemn us. Think of the scandal, the shame." "The shame?" Lysandra's laugh was sharp and brittle. "You left me in the cold. You starved me. You stripped me of my name, my dignity, my humanity. And now you speak to me of shame." Elara crawled forward, her silver gown torn and stained, her perfect hair falling loose around her face. "Sister, please. I was cruel, I know. But I'm young. I didn't understand. You have power now. You have everything. Surely you can forgive." "Forgive?" Lysandra wheeled her chair forward. and all three Haleveils flinched. You wanted me to disappear. You got your wish. Now you will disappear. She raised the royal seal, and the court leaned forward, waiting for the death sentence they all expected. Vampires didn't forgive. Vampires didn't show mercy. The only question was how brutal the execution would be. But Lysandra did not call for their heads. By the authority granted to me by King Vaelor Morvain, she said, her voice steady and cold, I strip House Haleveil of its title, its lands, and its name. The estate will be seized and redistributed. The wealth will be forfeited to the crown. And the three of you, she paused, letting the weight settle. You will be sent to the lowest district of the city to work as servants. No name, no rank, no mercy. Lord Haleveil's face went grey. You cannot, that's worse than death? Lysandra smiled, and it was not kind. Yes, I know. You told me once that death would be kinder than living as a burden. Now you'll understand exactly what you meant. Lady Morvain began to sob. Elara simply stared, her mind unable to comprehend the magnitude of her fall. Lysandra looked at them one last time, and her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. But in the silent hall, every creature heard it. You left me in the cold. I leave you in the dust. She turned to the Night Stalkers. Strip them. Remove every jewel, every piece of finery. They leave this hall as they made me feel. Worthless. The guards moved forward without hesitation. They tore the diamonds from Lady Morvain's throat, the rings from Lord Haleveil's fingers, the silver gown from Elara's body until she stood in nothing but a thin shift. The family's finery was piled on the floor like discarded costumes, and the nobles who had arrived in gold and arrogance were reduced to trembling, broken figures in rags. The court watched in absolute silence as the Haleveils were dragged toward the doors, their cries for mercy echoing through the Obsidian Hall until the iron doors slammed shut behind them. And Lysandra did not look back. The iron doors closed with a finality that echoed through the Obsidian Hall like a funeral bell. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. The court remained frozen, caught between the horror of what they'd witnessed and the dawning realization that the world had fundamentally shifted beneath their feet. Then, slowly, the musicians lifted their instruments. A violin sang out first, joined by a cello's deep voice, and the music resumed. But it was different now. The notes carried weight, gravitas, respect tinged with something the vampire nobility rarely felt. Fear. Not of violence or death, but of obsolescence, of being on the wrong side of power. Lysandra sat on the dais, the royal seal still warm in her palm, and watched as the nobles began to move again. They danced, they conversed, they continued the ball as protocol demanded. But their eyes kept drifting back to her, calculating, measuring, recalibrating their understanding of the realm's hierarchy. Vaelor climbed the steps to the dais and settled back onto his throne. For a long moment, they sat in silence, two figures crowned in moonlight and shadow, while the court swirled below them like a distant tide. You could have killed them, Vaelor said finally, his voice low enough that only she could hear. The court expected it. I would have supported it. I know. Lysandra turned the seal over in her hands, watching the crimson stone pulse. But death would have been too easy, too final. This way, they live with what they've lost, every day, forever. A small smile curved Vaelor's lips, cruel and merciful at once. You'll make a better ruler than I ever was. We'll make better rulers, she corrected, and handed the seal back to him. I'm not here to replace you. I'm here to keep you whole. He took the seal, but didn't put it away. Instead, he studied her face, the sharp intelligence in her eyes, the set of her jaw, the quiet strength that had survived years of systematic destruction. There's something I can offer you, he said carefully. Magic powerful enough to restore your legs, to let you walk again. The court mages could... No. The word was firm, final, and without hesitation. Vaelor's eyes widened slightly. Lysandra looked down at her legs, at the wheelchair that had carried her from prison to throne, and felt something settle in her chest. Not resignation, but acceptance. These legs don't work. They never will. And for years, I believed that made me broken, worthless, less than human. She looked up at Vaelor. But it was never about my legs. My family didn't abandon me because I couldn't walk. They abandoned me because I reminded them that perfection is a lie, and love is conditional. Fixing my legs won't fix that. And I don't need to be fixed. She touched the armrest of her enchanted chair, feeling the magic humming beneath her fingertips. This chair isn't a cage, it's a throne. Vaelor stared at her for a long moment, something like wonder crossing his ancient features. Then he stood and extended his hand. Come, there's something I want to show you. She took his hand, and he wheeled her through a side passage that led away from the ball. They moved through corridors of shadow and crystal until they reached a balcony overlooking the eastern mountains. The night was beginning to fade, the horizon bleeding from black to deep purple to the faintest hint of gold. The sun, Lysandra breathed. I had the balcony enchanted, Vaelor said, positioning her chair at the edge, shielded from the light. I haven't watched a sunrise in 800 years. I thought, perhaps we could see it together. He stood behind her chair, his hands resting lightly on the handles, and together they watched as dawn broke over the vampire kingdom. Light spilled across the mountains like molten gold, painting the world in colors that defied the darkness they'd both known for so long. Lysandra reached up and placed her hand over his, not possessive, not desperate, simply there, steady, grounding, real. I was invisible for 23 years, she said softly, and now I hold the leash of a king. Strange how quickly everything can change. Not quickly, Vaelor murmured, his thumb brushing across her knuckles. This took centuries. You were always going to be here. I just had to survive long enough to find you. And now? Now we rule. He leaned down, his voice close to her ear. You keep me sane. I keep you safe. And together, we build something neither of us could have alone. Lysandra smiled as the sun climbed higher, its warmth touching her face for the first time since her arrival. She was no longer the abandoned girl in the tower. She was no longer the broken daughter left to freeze. She was the Shadow Queen, the anchor of the kingdom, the woman who held a vampire king's soul in her hands and chose mercy over vengeance, partnership over power. And as the first true day of her new life dawned, Lysandra Haleveil, no, just Lysandra now, for she needed no family name, understood that she had never been broken at all. She had simply been waiting for a throne worthy of her strength.